Well, I'm Robert Manne, and today I'm talking to the historian Mark McKenna. Well, Mark, it's great to have you.
Thanks, Rob.
In Melbourne.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Perhaps before we begin to talk about the chapter you've written about the Republic, which begins the book, I've never asked you this, and I actually don't know the answer. You wrote a history of Republican thought in Australia. Did writing the history, as it were, begin your involvement in the issue, or was it because you were a Republican that you wanted to?
I think I was always a Republican, but certainly writing the history of republicanism in Australia at a time when the Republican debate in the early 90s had just started to take off. I found myself in the unusual position of my first book being about a major national topical issue.
By accident?
Yes, it certainly wasn't contrived on my part. I mean, I just found myself in that position. It was good fortune in a way. But I also had some sort of sense that this was going to be a end of century debate which Australia would engage in. So I think I was following my nose as much as anything.
Yes.
And the emotional, there's the intellectual democratic arguments for a republic, but also on a basic emotional level, I suppose there is a part of me that from a very young age was very, always asked the question, probably from my mid-teens, well, why should we now, as a fully independent country, continue our allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. So that was always there, I think, from a young age.
In the sort of the idea of a republic, and I'm thinking now before the sort of debate becomes politically serious in the 90s, seems to me the republic has two elements which are in a way quite different elements.
Yep.
One is the republic has built into it the idea of a really democratic polity, and I think the word itself is often used in that way, and I think even in our history. And the other meaning, which seems to me reasonably separate, is not to be part of something larger, which is British.
Yep.
When you got interested, was it both those elements that you were interested in, or did one predominate?
Oh no, certainly both. I mean, I think I'd read Paine, I'd read all the Enlightenment writings around the question of monarchy and republic, and I was a democratic Republican first and a nationalist Republican second. And I think still the democratic arguments for republic, for me personally, outweigh the nationalist ones. Certainly in our history, we've tended to play up the nationalist arguments. I mean, right back from the late 19th century, from Lawson and the Bulletin and so on, that tradition, right through to Stevenson and so in the 30s, it's this nationalist tradition. We can't have a British monarch as our head of state.
Yes.
We can't. We may have to forge our own way. This is, I think, the basic motivating force for Paul Keating's push for a republic. It was the nationalist argument, and I think also in Australian political culture, we're better at nationalist arguments. We tend to favour nationalist arguments more than the democratic ones, and that's partially because of the historical reality of Britain accommodating our evolutionary gradual emergence as an independent country, so that we've been able to become independent under the guise of the crown, under the symbolism of the crown and the monarchy. So that in part I think works against the effect of those democratic arguments, because monarchists will simply say, well, we're already democratic, what's the problem?
Yes.
But there is a real problem, I think, because especially now, the democratic arguments such as why should we have a head of state who can only be a member of one faith, the Anglican Church? Why should we have a head of state who, in a system where males take precedence over females? So Australians don't believe that merit, for example, should be put aside because of birth. Now, if we don't believe these things, then surely we shouldn't continue with the British monarch as our head of state. So those strong democratic arguments, I think, are even more valid now are more visible now, if you like, than they were earlier.
This is just for my information. I don't know. Has there been any really powerful democratic Republican writing in the Australian tradition, or is almost all of it dominated by the nationalist consideration?
It's a good question. It's certainly the nationalist consideration that's far more dominant. That even Malcolm Turnbull in the early 90s did put forward, as part of the Republican movement, did put forward the democratic arguments. But I think that in terms of public reception, the nationalist argument just tends to resonate more with the general public. But I think we're now in a position of, we're in a bit of a dilemma in that sense, because those nationalist arguments have been so strong, we're left with the conventional belief now that a republic is about an Australian head of state. Well, okay, let's take that proposition and ask ourselves a fairly basic question. Who or what will be the sovereign power in a new republican constitution? Will it be the president? Will it be the Australian head of state? Now, I'm sure we'd all agree we would not want to have the sovereign power of our constitution being the president or the Australian head of state. Call them what you will. Now, if that's the case, if the president is not the sovereign power, who will be the sovereign power in our constitution? And that question has only one answer. It's the Australian people. Therefore, if we, the people, are to be the new sovereign power in the Constitution, not the British monarch, not the Australian head of state, the Australian president, then we have to start asking ourselves about the image of popular sovereignty we want to embed and articulate in that republic. In a way, we have to start thinking about what sort of narrative, what sort of story that we are going to put in place
about the nation.
About the nation. And we have not found that story yet.
Yes. And in a way, what you're saying is that what I identified as the two aspects of republicanism, the democratic and the national. I think national rather than nationalist in a way.
Yes, certainly. National rather than nationalist has worrying overtones, that's right.
But let's say the national and the democratic come together inescapably in the process. Which leads me to a beginning point. I mean, it's a conscious decision to begin the book, Dear Mr. Rudd, with your chapter on the Republic, because it seems to me sort of almost crazy to think this doesn't matter or is a secondary issue, but it tends to be how Australians now think of it.
It does,
and that's why I wanted to ask you about Dear Mr. Rudd, the Prime Minister. One possibility is that he is genuinely cool about the Republic and, unlike Keating, doesn't care much about it. Another possibility is after the Howard years, it seemed to be something that was difficult during an election period to bring up as an issue, and it's clearly not an issue which is burning in public opinion. This is you probably don't know how to answer this, but I'll ask it. What do you think Mr. Rudd really does think about the Republic question?
Well, look, I think what Rudd, if this is all pure hypothesis on my part, I mean, I can do nothing else, but I think that Rudd is obviously being cautious about what he's saying on the Republic, and he's conscious of not wanting to rush too quickly or to be seen to be rushing too quickly to embrace those issues that were identified very much with Keating in the previous Labor government, especially with the end of the Keating era. So he's being cautious.
Be not Keating.
Yes. However, given what I've read of Rudd's writing, you can only conclude that Rudd would be a passionate Republican and very keen to preside over the introduction of an Australian Republic, and to do that in a way which is able to bring on board his opponents. I mean, he's shown signs of doing that already. I think the idea of a bipartisan committee for Indigenous affairs, for example, is superb, and we need only wait perhaps 10 seconds before other interest groups, such as environmental interest groups, for example, start knocking on Rudd's door if they haven't already and saying, well, why not include the environment as another issue where you would have bipartisan committees set up? Because these issues do transcend that partisan political divide, and Australians are surely tired of that kind of game playing between political parties over very, very substantial issues. On the Labor Party and the Republic, I mean, I think it's important to remember that when the Labor Party first embraced the issue as part of their national platform in 1991, they did so, and it's in the minutes of the Labor Party National Conference in Hobart in 1991, the motion to support an Australian Republic being declared by 2001 was carried not very enthusiastically, quote unquote.
Yeah.
So I mean,
well, it's in the minutes actually.
Yes. So there's a tension there within the party itself, which I think is assumed for ever since the Labor Party came to the view quite early on, from 1891, its founding year, that it was primarily going to focus on parliamentary reform rather than looking at some sort of utopian declaration in its platform. In other words, to focus on what it could achieve through parliamentary legislation. The Republic was assumed from that point on, if you like, to be a second-order issue. But look, again, this is the second conventional thinking about the Republic. The first conventional way of thinking is it's just about the Australian president. The second conventional thinking is that it's a single-order issue, or it's a second-order issue, or it's a non-issue.
Yeah.
Now, I find that quite remarkable.
It is. I mean, I think outsiders would find it completely remarkable that a country could think of these things as of second-rate importance.
Yes, certainly when you have lived out, as many of us have, travelled outside or lived outside of Australia, one of the first questions you'll get about Australia often bears on the question of either Indigenous issues or the question of a republic.
Yes.
And I think if you look at what happened with the apology in a few weeks ago, on the 13th of February, when Rudd apologised. Now, Rudd had said before the election, I will apologise to Aboriginal people. But I wonder how many of us, and I include myself here in this, how many of us actually forgot or didn't think or dwell long enough on the symbolic ramifications.
The power that...
Yes, and the power that this event would have.
I've written a lot about the issue, but I include myself in your general characterisation. I had forgotten what it might mean.
And so, in a way, the rituals and the theatre of that day in Parliament, and the day that preceded it, where Federal Parliament was opened for the first time with a formal welcome to country, those sorts of rituals had a tremendous effect on the body politic, which, I mean, and I don't just mean through reading newspapers or watching television, I mean through talking to people and witnessing. So many people had said to me, people who don't follow politics religiously, wasn't that a wonderful day? Part of the reason it was wonderful was because we saw politics transcending that partisan nastiness that we're all so familiar with, and we saw something larger about the nation that pointed to a national story that we've not witnessed before. And we really completely underestimated the potential symbolic power of that day. And I think that day shows us the potential symbolic power of a new Republican constitution, which we yet don't really comprehend the potential symbolism of.
That's really interesting. Now, I'm going to take you through the arguments of the chapter, because in a way what you're trying to do in the chapter is to convince the nation. Mr. Rudd is one of rather important member of the nation of the importance of the Republic issue. And I'm going to go through the argument bit by bit, because there's quite a lot of work to be done to do that. And I'll start with saying something about Paul Keating and his role in the whole thing. It seemed to me, and I'd like your response to this, two things about, not only two, but the two I want to highlight about Mr. Keating and the Republic are these. First is, I don't myself think that it would have become a central issue in Australian politics. In fact, I don't think there's any chance it could have become a central issue in the way it did without the enthusiasm of the Prime Minister, on the one hand. On the other hand, when I think back on it, I think Keating's interest in it was partly mischievously, partly not mischievously misconstrued by his opponents. I think that Keating was interested in the Republic in part because he was hostile to the conservative Menzies tradition. He wanted to put a knife in that tradition, and so on.
Sure.
And that's part of his psychology and part of his political background, part of his
that's true.
J.T. Lang sort of influence. But I think that was misconstrued as him being anti-British. And I think a lot of the undercurrent of the the interesting parts of the debate, the undercurrent was a feeling that we are not an anti-British nation and we're not going to become so now. And I know in your chapter, so I'd like you to respond to that and then to talk about the whole British question.
I think somewhere in my chapter I make the point that the Republic debate now is no longer about Australia's relationship with Britain. And in fact, that remark is one I've made, I think, now almost 10 years ago for the first time. I don't think that Keating's on record as saying many times that this was not about being anti-British. However, there were some aspects of, as you well know, of Keating's delivery and behaviour which could lend the impression that he was anti-British. I mean, when you look at that day in Federal Parliament in 1992, where Keating's on one side of the ledger pointing at John Huston and saying, "I tell you what I learnt at school. I learnt respect for Australia, not for some country that deserted Australia at the fall of Singapore," and so on. When you see those sorts of images, you get the impression of a man who still somehow deep down bears some of those Henry Lawson-like, what's the word, grudges, if you like, against the British, the British colonialism, British power, British cultural superiority, call it what you will. That Keating did give those impressions on occasion. But the whole question of a republic being perceived as part of Australia's relationship with Britain is now such a complete furphy. I mean, if you look at the question of our independence, surely we should all agree that if we ask, well, which country outside of Australia is one which we might measure our capacity for independence against, well, it's not going to be Great Britain, it'll be the United States. Yet you never see the question of our relationship with the United States being raised in the context of the Republic debate, quite oddly, because if there's any test of our independence, it's in that relationship, not in the debate with Britain. So what I think has to happen and will happen is that the whole question of a republic will now, from the election of the Rudd government, enter a new phase, and that is a post-Keating, post-Anglo-Australia, British Australia framework, and enter the much more interesting and long overdue phase of what is it about our history, our relationship with this country, our relationship and history with Aboriginal people. What is it about that national story that makes a republic imperative? And how does a republic speak to that national story?
One of the arguments that came up during the 90s from the constitutional monarchists, which I think is a powerful argument, and it's one you take head on in the chapter, is this very practical Australian attitude: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And your argument in the chapter is that it is broke.
Very much so. It's broke. The "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" line stems back to the late 19th century, right back from at least in Australia, from the 1840s and 50s, during the debates around transportation and self-government. You can find that argument trotted out. And certainly in the late 19th century, in the lead up to Federation, you can find the same argument: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now, in 1840, in 1850, in 1880, in 1890, that argument had much more force than it does now. Okay, if we take the Australian Constitution and we put this argument, it's not broke, there's no need to fix it, up, clearly we can see on so many levels on the question of state-federal relations, in education, in health, in constitutional powers, in the relationship between the legislature and the High Court. There's a whole raft of areas where the Constitution needs revision. On a much more fundamental level, how many Australians are aware of one phrase or one sentence of our Constitution? In 1901, the decade between Federation and, let's say, take it up to Anzac Day in 1915, that generation of Australians who'd, after all, voted in the Federation Convention referendums and so on, were very much aware of the language of the Constitution at the time. That Constitution spoke to them. It reflected their values, their ideals. We federated under one indissoluble Commonwealth under the Crown. Here we are with a Constitution where the language of our Constitution no longer speaks to the sort of people or nation we've become. That's the fundamental crux, I think, about constitutional language. I mean, one of the things I find quite irritating is this quite traditional Australian attitude that, well, political language, constitutional language, is somehow to be viewed with suspicion, that somehow this is all just grand rhetoric, which we as very practical people don't need to bother ourselves with. Well, there's one problem with that argument. The argument that's put up against the need for a new constitution, preamble, republic, call it what you will, all of those things, often runs along those lines, that we should view this as some sort of attempt to foist an ideological language upon the Australian people. But look at it this way. If you take recent debates since the election of John Howard in 1996, go back to the debate when Pauline Hanson first gave a speech in federal parliament, and you found this extraordinary situation where Parliament, both sides of Parliament, were running around trying to agree on the wording of a declaration which would tell the rest of the world what sort of country we were and what we believed in. So they passed this motion saying Australia was a country which did not believe, of course, in racial discrimination and so on. It believed in gender equality and so on. So we found both parties running around looking for the words that would tell us who we were. If you go forward now to the values debate, this quite extraordinary situation where we've had some people suggesting you can nationalise human values, that there are values that are Australian. Well, again, if you look at the values debate and the citizenship debate, you can see an uncertainty and a division and a grasping for some sort of definition of, well, what is it that we do subscribe to? What are our political values? I don't mean national values, I mean political values, democratic values. And so, in a way, there is a vacuum in our political culture. There is a need, a very real need, for a point of reference so that people can say, aha. I mean, there's a process through which we have to go to arrive at that point. But there's a very real need for that declaration of constitutional language which we see our own faces in. We recognise our own faces in.
And this is what you refer to the need for a narrative.
Yes, exactly.
Which reflects how contemporaries see the transition through which we've come.
I mean, one of the underlying assumptions on the part of some people is that, well, or at least the traditional argument of the idea of British constitutionalism in Australia was that values were understood. They didn't need to be spelt out. I mean, Britain, after all, does not have a written constitution. England does not have a written constitution. So that this idea of the values and practice of democracy being embedded in the fabric of society and being understood, in inverted commas, was one which carried us through all the way through till the 1970s at least, 60s and 70s. But we clearly now, through the debates that I've just pointed to, are in a situation, because of the diversity of our very society, ethnic, religious, any